Penelope, well, you should sit in the middle because you're recording for us.
I guess so.
Okay, so it's 7 o'clock. I want to thank you all for coming. Just one quick comment. There's a sign-up sheet if you think you're going to want to make public comments, just because we're trying to kind of hold to a little bit of a schedule so we're not here too late. Based on how many people in the public want to sign up, then we can determine, okay, if we're trying to stick to 20 or 30 minutes and 10 people want to speak, then we know there's about 2 minutes or so each. But first let me introduce Norrie, who's on the phone, calling in from Boulder. And Norrie Winter is the principal of Winter & Company, which is the contractor, the design firm that we contracted with almost a year ago to do these design guidelines. And he's going to walk you through this presentation. There'll be opportunities for questions from those in the public, and then there'll be opportunities for questions from council and the planning commission. I do want to just point out who was on the committee, the task force that oversaw this project for the past year. We have Mateo, we had Tim McQueen, was a late entry, Matt Baumgarten, Nathan Bissett, who's not here, he's an architect and a Berkeley resident, Ross Gavin, Conso, Kristen Kapolensky, Planning Commission, and I think that's it. So we tried to make sure we had stakeholders from all the important groups. Oh, Bridget, sorry. Sorry, Bridget. How could I forget you?
I don't know.
Thanks for pointing it out. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to sit down and turn it over to Norrie.
Great, thanks, Vivian. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be there with you. Let's say this is the easy way to travel and more efficient in many respects. But it's a delight to be back with the community, at least virtually, if not there in person. We've enjoyed working with the community and with the steering committee and with Vivian over the past several months on this project. And so I'm really excited to have this opportunity to give an overview. And I know that several of you there participated in one way or another along the way. And so I hope you will recognize your thumbprints on the document. We tried to take a lot of the public's ideas into consideration of developing the design guidelines. And now, okay, there we go. And we want to share what we've done. I'm going to walk through at a fairly high level the guidelines document, talk a little bit about its structure and organization, and then give you some examples of the design guidelines in it. I think the theme is we've really tried to custom tailor these design guidelines to fit Berkeley and the diverse sense of character that exists along 12 Mile and Coolidge. We will take some public comments and questions afterwards, and then we'll be interested in hearing from the council and the commission, and we'll talk just a little bit about next steps. I want to point out what guidelines can do in a situation like downtown Berkeley. First, it helps us convey the community's vision for the area, and we extracted a vision statement from a variety of workshop activities that we conducted earlier in the year, and from other planning documents that also talk about the future for downtown. It's a way for enhancing downtown for everyone who uses it, those who own property and operate businesses or other institutional facilities, for those who work there, and certainly for residents around the downtown. And in that respect, it serves to help support businesses that are neighborhood serving, and we took that into consideration in terms of some of the design ideas that we're going to be presenting. The design guidelines document also can help build a sense of pride in community, pointing to a future and pointing out the assets that the community has. Sometimes highlighting buildings that you might think are diamonds in the rough and showing how they can be polished to really shine on the street, if you will. And finally, you can give direction for developing city policies and regulations and can contribute to other planning concepts that might be developed in the next few years. The project did begin last September. We held a public workshop. Many of you may have participated in that. It was a lot of fun, but also really productive. People worked on a variety of activities to help us establish a vision for the area, to talk about the kinds of design characteristics they would like to see. After that, we developed an outline, we developed an in-house preliminary document that was reviewed with the committee and refined until we were ready to present that in an open house last March. And that also was well attended. We had a lot of people coming through to see blow-up sample pages of some of the guidelines themselves. And then we worked on the final document that we're presenting this evening. And I will note that it's going to be available online, or it is already available online. And Vivian can give you information about that afterwards, so that for those of you who do really want to see the whole document, you can get access to it. These are just a few images from that initial workshop. And a couple of things that were going on here is people were beginning to map the downtown along 12 Mile and Coolidge into some sub-areas, some character areas where the vision for development and the character design might be a little bit different. And that is that it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. And you will see that in the guidelines. And you also see people working with a series of photographs where they were selecting images that they thought would be appropriate within and placing them on the map for certain locations in general, and then also indicating designs that they felt didn't speak of Berkeley. And so that was a very informative exercise that helped us in developing the guidelines and in selecting illustrations of the document. This is the open house where we had blown up pages around the room for people to review, and we received comments on those. People added post-its with comments along the way, and we analyzed that information in developing the final draft. With that short introduction to the process, I wanted to talk a little bit about the organizational structure of the document itself. Now, some of these first slides will have a lot of text, and I'm not expecting those of you, particularly in the back, to be able to read the fine grain, and don't worry, that's not the point. I mostly want to show you at a high level how the document is organized. It does begin with a vision statement that includes some design principles and some definitions called design concepts that are used in the guidelines themselves. I will touch on a few of those in a minute. The bulk of the guidance itself is organized into one related to site design and one related to building design. You see within that there are a series of topics, site design dealing with some practical matters such as stormwater management, but also pedestrian circulation, addressing parking lots, how you might locate a building on a site. And the building design addresses mass and scale, the character of the first floor, for example, of materials and lighting, and a variety of environmental performance concepts as well. There is another chapter that focuses on renovation of buildings, and there are a lot of opportunities of existing buildings in downtown for enhancing them or converting them to new uses or making better use of front yards or side yards that exist. And so we developed a special chapter that takes some of the particular opportunities into consideration. And then there is a section on what are called character areas, and that relates to that mapping exercise that you saw in the workshop activity, where Community participants helped us think about downtown as being in three sub-areas, if you will. Gateway West, the downtown core, and Gateway South, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail later. And then some guidance about signs and the different kinds of sign types and where they might be appropriate for downtown. Now, that first chapter with the vision statement includes these basic design principles. The second chapter is that one, site design, as I noted. The third chapter is the one on new construction. This visual table of contents is one that enables people to access the chapter more quickly and to get an understanding of what they would find in the book overall. So this is a summary of the more detailed table of contents that I just showed you earlier. The guidelines themselves relate to that vision statement and the guiding principles that I'm going to show you in a minute in what we call a hierarchical structure. This will maybe make a little bit more sense after I show you what a guidelines page looks like. But the idea is that there's an overall vision for downtown, and that is that it's a vibrant place, it's the heart of the community, it has a mix of uses, it's pedestrian friendly, and it's linked to the neighborhoods. Following that are some more specific guiding principles that I'll get into, but they're still pretty high level, and they're aspirational, they're not things that you necessarily measure. Then moving closer to the design guidelines, I'm going to show you in a moment what we call an intent statement. And that might be, for example, the ground level of buildings at the sidewalk edge should be pedestrian friendly or interesting to pedestrians. That's an intent statement. And the guidelines that help apply that might say, use storefront windows, display cases, wall art, other devices to make that first level interesting. So the idea is that in many cases you would be working at the lowest level, the design guideline level, where it's rather specific. But in other cases, there may be a brilliant new idea that's come up that we didn't anticipate, and you can move up in the hierarchical structure of the document to consider how that new bright idea would relate to the intent and the guiding principles and even the vision statement for downtown. So the design principles themselves, again, you're not expected to be reading the fine print here. They're organized into a dozen or so statements. And again, you'll see they're pretty aspirational. Now, principle one, achieve excellence in design. We want to promote high quality design at any level. Two, design with authenticity. Avoid fake facades or thin veneers or phony designs that don't speak of Berkeley and that don't speak of authenticity in design. Third is to provide signature open spaces. There are a variety of public and private and semi-public, maybe, spaces that should be inviting and active. Fourth is to enhance the pedestrian experience, and that's a theme that comes through a lot of the guidelines. How do you make the sites and the buildings inviting for people to walk along and by them and walk to the next building and the next building and the next business and the next business? At the same time that we want to have some compatibility, though, we want to promote creativity, and that's principle 5, to encourage creative new designs that are still respectful of the design traditions of Berkeley. And in that respect, principle 6 is to draw upon those local design traditions. And that may be simple forms and materials that are those that are of the traditions of the community. Design with a consistency, that is, don't design a building to be so busy and broken up into smaller pieces that it doesn't speak of being a coherent design. Principle 8 is to design with durability, that is, to use materials that will last and that convey the fact that Berkeley is a place that's going to be here for a long time. Principle 9 is to design for sustainability, to accommodate new creative ways of saving energy, of generating energy, and promoting other means of sustainability, of helping to promote water quality, management, etc. And then to promote keeping the automobile subordinate. we're going to have the automobile, but let's not have it dominate the street. Now, with those basic principles in mind, I want to move into the level of the design guidelines themselves. And there's a format that is illustrated here that we use throughout the document. That is a heading or a title or a grouping of guidelines. In this case, the topic is building mass and scale. And under that are a series of guidelines related to building mass and scale. The particular one illustrated here is a topic related to building height. And so that has the intent statement. New development must meet zoning requirements in the district while stepping down to create smooth transitions with adjacent lower scale commercial and residential buildings. Now, that's certainly a concern that we heard in the community workshop about new development being compatible as it steps down to existing residential neighborhoods. Now, the guidelines themselves actually indicate things that you can do to help meet that intent. So guideline 3.11 is labeled here, and guideline 3.12. Occasionally there are bullets under that that are lettered that provide examples of how you might meet that design guideline. The idea here is, again, that I can operate at that lower level, but if I have a new idea, I can move up to that intent statement. There also are sidebars and photographs and sketches that help to illustrate the document. And when the illustrations are used, there's a check mark or an X mark to indicate whether or not it would be considered appropriate or inappropriate. Now, let's move into the chapter on site design. Each chapter divider page begins with a short introduction and a mini table of contents that drills down to the more specific guidelines that are included in the document. So you will recognize this kind of page as we move into new building design and into renovation design, sign design. As we look at an example, I've selected just a few of the topics within each of the chapters, particularly to highlight some that we heard from the community and advisory committee that were particularly important to address, or where I wanted to show you how the guidelines help or seek to promote creativity or show alternative ways of meeting the overall objective. So this one has to do with connectivity on the site. That is to provide connections for alternatives to the automobile, pedestrians and bicyclists, and to provide entries that orient to outdoor spaces and to those connecting walkways, paths, alleys, sidewalks, etc. And so there are three different conditions that are illustrated here for the way in which you might orient to the street. One is a storefront building might be set right at the sidewalk edge in a traditional Main Street kind of format where the entrance is directly accessible to the pedestrian way. But there are other places where the building is set back from the street a bit and a walkway might connect it. And in some cases that foreground is landscaped. In other cases it isn't, but we provide later on some ideas about what you can do with those spaces. Or there might be even a more formal courtyard, a dining patio, or some other decorated paved surface that could serve as an entry that might actually be set back a bit farther from the street. The point being, make sure that's a comfortable connection for pedestrians. Now that might be stating the obvious, but there are occasions downtown that we saw where that link wasn't necessarily as strong as it could be. So there's a variation on pedestrian connectivity, and that is the opportunity to create some mid-block or through-block connections. Sometimes that happens along side yards that might be used for a patio or dining, that might link to a rear parking lot, and that might then link up with another project. So there's some suggestions about providing those connections because they help to break up the block, provide more access to parking that might be behind and or to other uses. there's a related topic, and that is what we call the public and private interface. And that is that all of those outdoor spaces out there are owned either by a private property owner or there is a public right-of-way. And understanding how they interrelate is important in terms of writing design guidelines, because in some cases you may have something that feels city public, even though it may be owned by the city or it might be owned by a private property owner. So the guidelines make a distinction between this, because in some cases who the guidelines apply to differs depending on the ownership of the property. But the underlying point here is that from a pedestrian standpoint, these should all be inviting places, ideally activating the street and keeping the area vibrant. Now, a minute ago, I touched lightly on the concept of the transitions from the commercial or mixed-use areas along 12 Mile and Coolidge, where they, on the backside, abut established single-family neighborhoods. And the guidelines address some different ways in which a transition might occur that is more compatible and more respectful of the adjacent neighborhoods. To some extent, this depends on the depth of the lot on the commercial street. There's several situations where it's shallow, there's not a lot of extra room, and there's already rear parking. But thinking about providing a comfortable landscape buffer in that situation is addressed to the guidelines. There are some other areas where there might be a little bit more depth and some more landscaping can be added, and even some outdoor patio kinds of spaces that could help to enhance that backside. And then lastly, for really deep parcels, and there are not many, but a few, where the transition could actually be in some compatible, smaller scale residential row houses, for example, might be a possibility to act as a transition between the commercial development. So those are illustrated in the guidelines. Now, while there is a lot of consideration for making efficient use of parking, and in some cases parking is perhaps at a premium, there are some cases where nowadays there may be more parking spaces in one particular location than are needed based on the use and also the changing patterns in the way we drive, and or as we make downtown more walkable, the number of people that may walk from neighborhoods may reduce parking demand. Whatever, there may be situations where activating some underutilized parking spaces as outdoor display areas and seating areas, or even as group dining areas, might be a possibility. And so the design guidelines address that, and they illustrate some opportunities for making use of one or two extra or underutilized parking spaces in a variety of other ways. Here you see examples where a little bit of a mini park is added at a corner, and the outdoor dining area is added in another location, and an outdoor seating or play area is added in another location. And there are a variety of places in downtown where this kind of a design guideline could apply. Moving to Chapter 3, related to new buildings, we're talking a little bit about massing and articulation, because we heard that those were considered concerns that the community had, that as some properties may redevelop or as additions might be constructed, that they do so in a way that maintains the scale and the character that people love about downtown right now, which is predominantly one and mostly two-story scale, if you will. And so the design guidelines related to building scale talk about maintaining that lower height at the street edge, but do acknowledge that in some cases it is possible to add a floor, and maybe it's even in a few cases 2 floors, where the lots are deep enough and still be compatible with the context and still maintain a 2-story scale at the street edge. And part of that is the way in which that building is articulated. These photos are examples of single buildings in brick on the upper right and a single building with lap siding in the lower right that are divided into 3 modules, if you will, so that they appear to be in scale with the traditional building widths that exist. So it's an interaction between height and scale that's being illustrated here. Another term related to that is building articulation, varying wall planes, varying cornice lines, and stepping back upper floors to maintain that lower scale at the street edge, and the same principle applying on the back sides where you might be abutting residential neighborhoods to step down to be more compatible with scale. And so this illustration helps to address that in the design guidelines. There then is a broader discussion of building articulation, and this is perhaps the first example of what I would call a menu of design options. And in some cases, you can mix and match these to create a design that will have variation in form and mass that will appear to be in scale and character with the smaller buildings that are part of the design traditions of the community. So again, here we have some of the design techniques, wall offset notches that might occur to divide buildings into smaller modules, or variations in the height of the structure, or offsetting major portions of walls, or certainly stepping back floors. The point being that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and it's not dictating one way of articulating. It's suggesting a variety of ways. The guideline is to provide articulation to reduce building mass and to create a sense of compatible scale. These are ways in which to do that. And there are a variety of others that I'm not going to show you that the guidelines include. But the point is that we're working with the idea that there's variety, there's choice, and creativity in solutions is welcome. This page goes farther in illustrating some of those ideas that were shown in the model of how you might articulate, that is, break up a building to create visual interest and to reduce its sense of scale. Now, we've used that same kind of a menu idea for some other kinds of design issues or opportunities, if you will, that occur downtown. And one is there's several buildings that are set back from the sidewalk edge. They're not the traditional Main Street building with a storefront right at the sidewalk. And they're some of these are landscape lawns, and they're quite inviting. Others really are missed opportunities, maybe, to enliven the street and at the same time expand or enhance whatever business activity might be going on at front in the building. So what we've done here is to illustrate a variety of ways in which you could activate that kind of underutilized front setback area. It could be along with benches, it could be an outdoor seating area, perhaps for dining. It could have some form of a shade structure that visually extends the building out and provides shelter for some activity uses or for displays of products that might be sold inside. There could be other examples of adding a very lightweight kind of glass structure, a greenhouse almost, if you will, depending on the use. And then certainly just bringing the storefront forward. So those are all options that are illustrated. And here's just the blow up of that idea in a little bit more detail. But again, that's meeting a guideline that says activate the street frontage even when your building is set back, and do so in a way that's going to invite pedestrian activity. We've used the same idea for another situation that we observed in Berkeley, and that is there are some side lots that are perhaps underutilized, or as functions change, there may be opportunities for improvement. Some of those right now are probably a parking lot. And in some cases that might continue, but perhaps by adding a little bit of landscaping and that little small outdoor use area that looks at the parking lot illustrations I showed earlier, that could help to activate the street edge. What's happening is there is you're beginning to kind of fill in the gap of the street wall, not necessarily with a building, but with other uses that help to animate it. And options 2 and 3 show some other variations on that. 2 is a little bit more formal, but it's also adding a pedestrian connection, one of those mid-block connections from the main street back to parking or service areas in the back, or even to perhaps another use. And then the foreground one is similar. It's a combination of the activation of the street frontage, but actually constructing an addition to the side of the building as well. So again, an enlargement of what those options are, so that you can see what's going on there. Now here's another menu. Or actually, this is what we would call just a visual definition for, in some extent, of building materials. And so there's a palette of materials here that are listed: brick, which is the masonry, of course; stone, which also is a form of masonry; and also architectural concrete has been detailed in some way. And then accent materials, which means maybe metals or concrete. And then it also addresses some synthetic and panelized materials and indicates where those materials might be appropriate as a primary material or as a secondary material, and where it might be acceptable as an accent material. Here you see an enlargement of that. So this is kind of a visual definition, if you will. And it's linked to a table that helps to, that explains the intent of the use of this. And the point is that they should be materials that provide a sense of scale, that have a sense of durability to them, and that continue the masonry tradition, but at the same time allowing for new variations on them, or encouraging some creativity in use of new materials along the way. But that when all is said and done, there's a sense of continuity and relatedness to the buildings, so that it all reads as downtown Berkeley. Now, moving into some of the other opportunities for diamonds in the rough, if you will. And one is adaptively reusing buildings that were auto-oriented, that were garages, mechanical, auto body facilities, for example. There are not many, but there are a couple, and there may be others along the way that that may not technically have been a garage, where some of these ideas might apply. And so these guidelines show suggestions for what you might do where you have an overhead garage door. One is you just replace it with a storefront. Another is you might make it be a more optimal storefront, but now for a commercial use. So that could open up to be a dining area, for example. And there's an example down below of an auto-oriented business that was converted into a restaurant. And here again, you see it enlarged by those options. So again, some suggestions for how you meet the guideline of activating that storefront now to be more pedestrian-oriented. Related to that is how to treat the street level wall, that ground floor for any type of building, wherever it might be. And sort of the fallback preferred option is that there be windows, that there's something for people to see and look at, activities going on. You can see goods and services of people working inside. You see people working out inside. That's the preferred option, but that doesn't always fit a building's operational needs or the program functions inside. That doesn't mean, though, you just give up on addressing the street. So this illustrates some other ways of doing that. You can have display boxes where you can display products or activities, but you're not literally looking into the building. You can have color and accent added by awnings, or wall art, or even landscape planners along the way. So again, a variety of options. And how do you meet the intent of making that street level interesting, regardless of the building type and regardless of the use? So here again, you see a little bit of a enlargement for that. We took that same idea to the size of some of the smaller, what I would call plain front buildings maybe. And there are a variety of these buildings, and it's really exciting to see the way in which people are using them. And so in some cases, you have two businesses in one building, and they're trying to figure out how do they identify themselves and their individuality. But at the same time, how do you create the strength of the image of the single building facade? And that's particularly important for some of the really smaller shop fronts. So option one here shows you how you use color and accent to identify the two different buildings and to highlight the openings that are there and coordinate them. And whereas B is one in which the two designs are kind of going in opposite directions, they're fragmenting the visual strength that the building provides. The second scenario is kind of the reverse of that, and that is a single business that occupies two buildings. How do you do that to help, though, keep that sense of module of smaller scale facades along the way? Well, you might do it as an example, number 2A here, where you use the same color, perhaps as an awning, over all of the windows for the two buildings, even though that's a single business, as opposed to just stretching one long awning over both buildings, because then you lose that sense of rhythm of smaller scale buildings. So here you see that those two alternatives illustrated here, a more coordinated option and one that's fragmented. Now, another area the guidelines address are rooftop additions, and we've heard that some property owners are interested in doing this. And one way to do that is respectful of the original design and also can help maintain the lower street level scale is a step back, adding to the back side or at least stepping back a bit so that the front cornice line of the original building is maintained. And these are examples of doing that. So those are some of the examples of the guidelines for site design, new construction, and alterations to existing buildings. And then let's move quickly to just look at the character areas. Now, this framework map itself refined it during that community workshop. And we have these three different character areas: Gateway West, Downtown Core, and Gateway South. And within the core, there are actually some sub-areas. That is a key part of the chapter dealing with the gateway, with the character areas. Now, they are just a narrative discussion to help in applying the general guidelines that you've looked at that come before this chapter. The main thing here that's to highlight are these design objectives, which get to a little bit finer grained vision for these different parts of downtown. So, for example, you see the list of objectives here for the Gateway West area along the 12-mile road. It's a mix of commercial and residential, but to really celebrate the arts and crafts businesses that occur here, to really encourage some outdoor activities and product displays that add to that richness, that kind of sense of discovery that exists here, and to be certain that there's a diversity of signage that adds to kind of a sense of excitement of this area. So that relates to the guidelines that preceded. The downtown core has its own set of objectives, and there's certainly some that repeat for each of the areas, wanting to have a pedestrian-friendly street level, promoting the two-story scale at the street, and the consistency of street walls, particularly important here. That is, encouraging any new building to build up to the street wall, to the sidewalk edge, rather than being set back, and certainly not to put parking in front of the buildings, but to the rear. Area 3 is the chunk of Coolidge to the south, where similar objectives of being pedestrian friendly, etc., is important. but acknowledging that there is more opportunity for some residential to be developing in this area, mixed in with commercial, but still maintain that scale, that lower scale at the street edge and also at the backside edges where we transition into the residential areas, and to look at how some of those underutilized parking lots might be adaptively reused, some of the kind of outdoor use suggestions that show up in the design guidelines. Lastly, in the bulk of the document, there's a section on signs, and the main thing to point out here is that we really encourage permitting blade signs or projected signs because they're more pedestrian oriented. They provide opportunities for animating the street, and at the scale that the streets are in downtown Berkeley, they would be well suited. We've also indicated where certain other kinds of sign types might be more appropriate and where they might be inappropriate, particularly pole-mounted signs, which tend to be more of a strip commercial or oriented, auto-oriented kind of concept. So we've suggested those be more limited in the way in which they are applied. Then, all of this comes together. Now, an appendix is usually something that's kind of left over that no one reads. In some respects, the appendix is maybe the most exciting part of this document, because what it does is it says, when you take all of these guidelines, what might a project look like, and then it tests them. We had an economist working with us to run some pro forma analyses to sort of see what would be feasible. And the good news is the trend in the market in Berkeley right now is strengthening, and the demand for commercial and multifamily is strengthening, and that while some of the ideas that we've illustrated here might still be a little bit down the road in terms of market feasibility, they're close enough for us to be comfortable that what we're illustrating is something that can happen. So we took 3 sites, we call them opportunity sites. 2 of them are literally identified. The other one is a more abstract site. But they represent some conditions that exist, and even these that are very specialized that we're going to show you have some general principles that apply to lots of places. So the first one is this opportunity site number 1, which you might recognize. It's because this is where City Hall is, right here, and the old historic fire station is there at the corner of southeast corner of 12 Mile and Coolidge. The second site is right across the street, and we chose these because it shows an opportunity where some coordinated development on different sites could yield some pretty exciting results, all but illustrating principles of the design guidelines. So this is an aerial concept for the corner there, the southeast corner of 12 Mile and Coolidge, that illustrates if you were to put several of these design principles to play, what might you get? This actually assumes that municipal offices would stay on site in a new building, but be embedded more in the back so that retail and office uses could be wrapping around it to activate the street edge. There's a plaza leading back to the parking structure, and then the historic firehouse is maintained. Now, this is not a formal proposal, and we're not suggesting that anyone's property would be taken. These are all situations where we're showing opportunities for property owners to collaborate and develop something that would be of benefit to all. And you see several principles here at play: activated street edge with storefronts, variation in modules, adding back of building form and building height along the way, providing some variations in roof lines, activating outdoor use areas as well. So several of the guidelines I showed you, if you combine them, you could get something like this. And here's a little side plan that illustrates that a little bit more. So the wrapping of those commercial and office spaces around the edges of 12 Mile and Coolidge, the preservation of the historic firehouse adapted to a good use, a civic plaza for gathering. It would also provide an entranceway to the new municipal hall and the link to the parking. Now, this is a big, ambitious one. But it illustrates several of the precedents that could occur, and it is illustrating the concept of developing more parking, but in a way that is beneficial to a variety of users. And here's another overview view of what that might be like. Again, not a formal proposal, an illustration of the guidelines in action. Moving across the street, this project is one that said, well, what if it doesn't provide parking on site? What if it makes use of that parking structure across the street? It allows us to create some more intensity of development while activating the street edge. You will see here that idea of a mid-block connection, a pedestrian connection is being illustrated as well. And here's a three-dimensional representation. Similar kinds of concepts, storefronts, modular articulation of the buildings themselves, stepping back mass, and providing those connections through to abutting uses. Now, those same principles, while we're illustrating them on these sites, just as people could envision how they might really work someplace downtown, I can also envision this happening on any number of sites that are vacant, or some of the cases that might be redeveloped. The final one is one of those deeper sites that I alluded to earlier. This is one that goes much deeper, and does not have a specific location, but there are 2 or 3, or maybe more even, situations where this might exist. And in this case, it actually includes retaining some existing buildings, adding some other commercial ones along the street edge, developing some landscape parking in between, with a pedestrian connection to a transition of some small-scale multifamily residential buildings to the back. And here you have, oops, a little too fast there. Here you see an illustration of what that might look like. And so several of the design guidelines are being noted here that you will see in the text of the document, and some suggestions for some residential transitions behind, and another view of that. So again, what might this all be like if you put the guidelines all together? So that's the presentation. In looking back at it, what the guidelines can do is provide, again, that vision that is distinctly Berkeley. I think we're trying to tailor these guideline concepts to the kinds of buildings, the kinds of opportunities that exist in the downtown. We're trying to offer opportunities that show there are a wide range of choices that individuals can do to meet their own needs, their budget, their programmatic requirements, their vision for their development, but at the same time that everyone is kind of rowing in the same direction and helping to guide downtown in a direction that respects its heritage but moves forward. The guidelines provide clearly illustrated criteria that will help people in planning their projects. And it's a way that people can know that when they invest in a property, that others around them will invest in a like way, and that overall that will be a benefit to the community. So with the guidelines at this stage, the DDA will be asking the city to consider adopting them as a formal document for the downtown, and to establish a design review process for administering them. And so we wanted to use this study session opportunity to introduce you to the document so that as you might begin considering implementation of it, you have an understanding of the way it's organized, the structure it has, the flexibility it offers, and yet within a hierarchical structure that can provide a way of informed decision making and helping property owners make informed decisions about their improvement schemes. So at this stage, Vivian, I think it's time to turn it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Nori. So we do have time now. We have about 20 or 25 minutes for questions or comments from the public who are here. I didn't know how many were going to show up, but there's not a whole bunch of you. So maybe if you could just, if you have questions for Norrie, you could just kind of state your name and ask the question, and then hopefully keep it to about 3 or 4 minutes if there are actual questions, just based on the number of people here. So, anybody have questions? Oh, they must all be in love with it.
Either that or stun silence, I don't know. But we do recognize it's a lot to absorb all at one time. And to some extent, it's sort of the reader's guide, so that as you know, maybe take time on your own to get into the document, you'll kind of know what you'll better understand what we're doing and understand how it's working. Because I know Vivian will want, and she'll talk to you about how to send in comments later on for those who want to look at the document more before they provide any ideas.
Yeah, can you speak up? So.
Yes, my name is Wendy. I'm a resident of Berkeley. Yeah, I find it very ambitious. And I also, I'm very concerned about parking issues being solved sooner than later. Somehow, some way, we've got to do something different with that. I see that you're building in some of this, but of course, this is not going to be something done in the next 2 years. And our parking is a mess now. And I really want to see both the Planning Commission and City Council work on something, whether it be trying to get the different business owners together and make some kind of a parking agreement, because they all won't talk to each other. I just think there's things that can be done that need to be looked at. And this is awful ambitious, and I can see a long-term plan, and I get the idea. And a lot of things look very nice, but I don't see really some of this in my lifetime, quite frankly. But I guess that's all I have.
Great, thank you.
Well, George, that was a great comment, and actually, it helps you out the fact that I probably, right at the very beginning, didn't do a very good job of distinguishing design guidelines from the downtown plan. And design guidelines generally are written to be reactive to when a property owner is going to make improvements. They address how do you do it, what does it look like, what is its character. A downtown plan looks at some of the issues you're talking about, which is parking supply, parking location, parking management. It can address other things about the public realm, what does the street section look like? Are there bike lanes or not? Is there on-street parking or not? How does the signage and wayfinding work, etc. Now, it happens that the DDA is helping to sponsor a downtown plan, and I'll let Vivian talk about that in a minute. But I want to talk a little bit about the relationship of the two. The idea here is these are now design concepts, development concepts, that in this next step of planning, that your community can say, okay, we now understand what an intense parking lot might look like. Now let's look at where they might be located. Let's get more specific on the map with the plan. Or, yes, we see the idea of how a parking structure might fit into the downtown. Now let's get more specific about where it might go. Or any other of the other kinds of improvements that are located here that are shown in the guidelines. So, thanks for the question, because it really helps cue up that we need to make a clarification between it. The idea is that ultimately guidelines and a plan will work hand in glove, so that the plan says we want to promote X happening here, and the guidelines say here's what it can look like. So Vivian, maybe something to answer, something you would have wanted to answer?
No, not at all,
Okay.
Lori. No, good job. Thanks.
Okay.
We did issue an RFP for a downtown plan and parking study update, which will become the DDA's portion of the master plan update. But those RFPs or those proposals are due in at the end of this week. But that will start to address then land use and all the things that Noreen just talked about. And then, complement what we've done here with the design guidelines.
Other questions?
Yep.
Hi, my name is Annalise Petrus. I live on.
Can you hear, Noreen?
No, I can't.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Yeah, I'll move over here. My name is Annalise Petrus I live on Franklin in Berkeley. Can you hear that?
Can you hear her, Noreen?
Vivian, you may have to repeat that. She makes her
Do you want to sit up?
Yeah.
Oh, she could
Or just, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my questions are more pertaining to process. I really like a lot of what I see. But I guess my question has to do with process. Like, to me, it seems like there's a lot of component pieces that just need to get folded in, or this gets folded into another. Is this a step onto, bridging back to Woodward, that Berkeley has a presence on Woodward? I guess overall, I like it so much, I want to see more, right? Like, how do we solve a lot of these things as a city, like along 11, like just, maybe you have to start with just what define as a downtown, but I think the vision could be good, that there's more discussion about vision, and how does this body interact with planning commission, with zoning, with the development director, who's not here? Like, how do we communicate so that it is a full citywide, response, more community involvement? I guess those are the things I'd like to see.
Thanks.
Okay, well, I think there are two or three questions there, comments that I might want to respond to. One is the point that, and it sort of relates to the earlier comment as well, that when you look at the guidelines and the illustrations, they can be ambitious, but that's why they also, at the other end of the spectrum, have those illustrations for what can I do with just a can of paint and an awning or a sign on my existing small building. So it addresses small-scale incremental improvements, the buildings and the site. And you're right, as one property redevelops, the idea of, say, of providing a pedestrian connection back to parking will get implemented at the time that property redevelops. So the guidelines by themselves are contingent upon when a property owner initiates work. Now, the city and through the DDA can prime that pump a bit by offering assistance, which it does to some extent now, with design assistance or other kinds of grants or loans for some facade renovation work, or partnering in a joint venture development. There are ways to accelerate what the market might be doing on its own otherwise. In terms of, there's another question there which relates to implementation, and what we've recommended be considered now is that these be formally adopted as a zoning overlay over the downtown area, and there would be a formal design review process established with a design review committee working with city staff to review projects in the area, and that approval would be a requirement. Now, there are a variety of ways that can get implemented. There are a variety of thresholds for when design review kicks in versus it being voluntary or just incentive-based. And I think some of those are details that as the discussion for implementation moves forward would be worked out. But the recommendation is that these be formalized so that we know that even though it may take time, that as people make improvements, the pieces of the puzzle will start to fit together, and the overall image that we're aspiring to here will be envisioned. Now, the last question I'll answer that we're touching on is, again, the interaction with a master plan, the downtown plan, where that can help to stimulate other kinds of things as we move along faster, particularly where the city or the DDA actively engage in implementing some of those improvements, and that might be streetscape enhancements. It can be partnering in development projects or a variety of other techniques, using the design guidelines again to be certain that those projects are all in keeping with the character of downtown.
So I think one of the other things she was asking, or what she was hoping, is that these design guidelines would extend at some point in time to Woodward and 11 Mile, which are obviously outside of the DDA district.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay.
So.
I didn't hear that.
Yeah. So that obviously moves out of the DDA's hands, and who knows what, I mean, my guess is that Planning Commission at some point in time could take those guidelines and apply them to other areas, or, maybe address issues in other areas through them. But because that's outside of the DDA's kind of area of responsibility, we'd have to, that would have to be something that Planning Commission took. But I agree with you. I think it would be nice to see if they could expand to other areas that are commercial districts, on the edges, and not just in our historic, kind of DDA district.
Yeah,
Yes.
that is quite possible. My recommendation is take it a step at a time.
Yeah.
Put them into action, kick the tires a bit, and the community is comfortable with them, then there will be that support. Because the public process does not advertise them as potentially addressing those areas, I would be a bit cautious about all of a sudden now saying, oh, we're going to expand the boundary. Not that it isn't merited, but I think we really want to respect the public process here, and the notifications that we're all about the DDA boundary.
Yeah. David, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yes, I had a question about the guidelines in general.
So we do have a time, as soon as we finish public comments, then.
Okay, you want to wait? Okay.
Yeah, so let's just finish up public comments,
Okay.
and then we can move to any questions that planning
Okay.
and council have. So, are there any other comments from our audience? Okay, I think we're done with public comments, so does that mean that David can ask his question now?
No.
My question is that.
Can you hear him, Norrie? Can you hear David?
Yeah.
Okay.
You can hear, most people can. My question is regarding the guidelines and implementation of the guidelines and passage of however they're going to be developed and who's going to do all that. When it comes to the master plan, the master plan is usually written and it's revised about every 5 years, and then every 10 years it's rewritten. If the guidelines are available, are you guys, and I guess it comes down to the DDA and the consultants, are you going to be looking at these guidelines as time goes by and modify them or make any changes to them? Because I don't know whether we would want to adopt the guidelines in the master plan or whether we would want to reference the guidelines in the master plan. But if we adopted it into the master plan and then you guys came along and started changing them every couple of years, then we got to write an addendum to the master plan. You following my conversation?
Yeah, did you hear
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. Absolutely, I did. And now I, to be honest, I've not studied a lot of the technicalities of the way in which the land use law works in Berkeley, but the scenario in which they are referenced is generally the way we implement them around the country. They are a part of the zoning code or the development code adopted as a zoning overlay. And so there would be some language in the zoning code that says there shall be this design overlay, and they shall use design guidelines in making their decisions. And the design guidelines are adopted by resolution generally, and mechanically in some communities that just tells you how many hearings you have to have, that sort of thing. But you're right, you want to be able to revise them more easily than your master plan.
Thank you.
Guys, more questions? Yeah.
See if I can put this coherently. Is the intent to amend the zoning code to include the entire report, including the appendix and all of the illustrations and everything that's in this report into the zoning code? Is that what you envision doing?
I don't think that, so Nore, jump right in. I think as an overlay district, that would become a part of the zoning code.
The whole
That-
thing?
Yes, that then would say, okay, if you're doing A, B, C, or D in the DDA district, then you need to, projects then go before the design review board. But I don't see that this becomes, particularly the appendix, it's there as opportunity sites to spur creativity and thought. But it's not something that would be adopted as part of the zoning code.
Well, yeah.
Like generally, it would be a half a page or maybe 2 pages of text in the zoning code that says, there shall be an overlay, its boundaries are these, and here are the review procedures.
All right, so essentially
and so it will
procedural.
say,
Yes.
there will be a review board, they will approve or they recommend to the planning commission to approve, so it sets up how does the actual approval process work, and it's a particular process, those sorts of things are set forth there. Now, some of those are things that already exist in the code for any kind of land use decision. So depending on how much already exists in the code, it can be a half a page or 2 pages that sets it up. There are occasions where literally the entire guidelines document is adopted in the code, and that's generally where a city attorney feels they need to be there to feel comfortable that they are enforceable. But most communities, the general guidance we hear from land use attorneys is, you set up a system in the code, you say they shall use the guidelines in making their approvals, but you don't actually embed the whole document into your code.
Yeah, and I would concur with that because these guidelines are too general and too vague to be enforceable as code requirements. So I think a requirement that a procedure be set up that in good faith you consult the guidelines is definitely the way to go. And I think even that might run into some difficulties even doing it that way, but that's the better way to do it.
I think that's where that design review board is kind of a critical component of that process, so that, they can then say, okay, let's look at this against the guidelines, make recommendations, and move forward from there.
The thing is, if you give them too much arbitrary power, though, you begin to run into some legal difficulties, or you could.
Well, the design review board works I mean, it's well established, and in neighboring communities, and has worked historically very well. So I think that that's a great opportunity for us. Yes, Steve?
I was building on that topic. Can you elaborate a bit more about the composition of the design review board? How many members, from which other groups? How is it, is it on demand that it meets, or is there a regular schedule? Can you just shed a little bit of insight into some of those procedures?
Well, from my perspective, and Nora can jump in too, I mean, I see that as something that we kind of, as to how often it meets or whatever, is kind of tweaked based on, Berkeley's circumstances, whether it's it's a set monthly meeting or whether it's, on demand or whatever. As far as the makeup, I mean, I think it's critical to make sure that we have all those key stakeholder groups and represented. So, you'd want to have planning commission on there, you'd want a council member on there, you'd want, an architect, you'd want a landscape architect, you'd want a DDA representative, you'd probably want, maybe a property owner or something like that. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that I think we know we need to make sure that that all those stakeholder groups are represented.
Right.
But you don't want it to get so big that it becomes unwieldy either.
Right.
So the nice thing about these, I think the design review board is that we can really look at it and create what we need to fit who Berkeley is and Berkeley's needs. But they are successful, and they work well. And I think while our design guidelines are, I think that they're a lot more detailed and give a lot more oversight and suggestions that once you delve into them, I mean, they are 114 pages long and go into a great amount of detail. And this is precisely why the task force chose Wintering Company, because we felt like they were going to bring us a product that could be used and would be practical and wouldn't just be something that was hypothetical and would sit on a shelf. I mean, these are here with the hopes of being implemented and to improve the overall, design aesthetics and pedestrian experience in the DDA district. So, Nora, feel free to add anything to that you might feel I've missed.
We've crafted them so that they, some people may say they're vague or something like that, but they're pretty specific. You are generally going to know if you are meeting the intent of the guidelines for any of the particular categories that are being discussed. The concept of the guidelines is that they are more flexible than just a prescriptive code. I mean, the code could say you must have storefronts on every building downtown. Well, and I can measure it, and a form-based code also will say you've got to have 30% transparency, and a staff person will get a ruler out and measure. And if you don't have 30%, you've got 28%, then you've got to ask for some form of variance or administrative exception. And you can set that up, but you're still pretty constrained. The guidelines process gives you more flexibility. It does mean that some people have to do some thinking, and that's the reason for having the design review board. Now, one technical aspect to it, I think, Vivian, is you normally would not have a planning commissioner or a city council member as a voting member on that board. It depends on how appeals processes are set up. If the appeal is to the planning commission or to the council, you don't want someone reviewing something in an appeal role that would participate in the design review. What communities often do is they'll have a liaison from those bodies who participates in the discussions, et cetera, but they don't vote.
Gotcha.
Cool.
So have
We looked and seen if there are any issues with our current zoning in these areas and these design guidelines where they clash.
Yeah, so actually, let me just, you can finish up what
Go for it. Go for it.
yeah. The one thing we've known from the beginning, and, the city is well aware of too, and obviously everybody here is well aware of, is that our ordinances are decades out of date. So we do know that these will drive some more immediate ordinance review. I mean, when you look at signage, you can tell right away. We all know signage needs to be addressed. Design committee has been working on some recommendations that are just fixes while, the city looks to overhaul those complete ordinances. But what they will do is highlight ordinances that maybe need to be addressed a little more quickly. But yeah, I mean, our ordinances are far out of date, and hopefully these will help guide some of that ordinance update. Because we've put this work in and you've got the foundational stuff there that will now help make it easier for whoever the city brings in as a consultant to, or whether, they leave it to you guys to do internally. I think to make that process a lot more easily, at least as to how it relates in the DDA district. Nora, do you have anything to add to that?
No, you got it.
So my follow-up question to that is, because so many ordinances need to be updated, it's not a quick process, right? And while there might be some that we can bring faster than others, it's a lot to deal with. So adopting this, I'm guessing we're not looking at adopting it 2 years down the line. So,
Well, right now, I think the major ordinances that you're going to see addressed are things like signage, which has to be addressed right away. We're not talking land use. We've already got the facade grant program in place. I mean, I'm trying to think if there's actual.
Really, the only one that we were really aware of was particularly the blade sign situation, where I believe that's prohibited still. Isn't that right, Vivian?
Well, it's not prohibited, but they're very limited in size. So for the most part, I think it's probably signage, although, Kristen, can you think of anything else that would?
Not off the top of my head, but I was thinking if this is the direction that the council and the planning commission would want to head, there are easy Band-Aids we could put on the ordinance so that this would supersede other ordinance provisions, et cetera, while we work on updating the remainder of the ordinance.
Yeah. It's kind of.
No, I don't think they're major conflicts. So I think patches like that could do it if they are identified.
Yeah.
I have
Well, we've kind of finished that part, but there will be opportunities to submit questions and comments online.
That's kind of had to do with what he says, right?
Well, let's finish up and just see if there's any other questions from council and planning, and then we'll see where we are timeline-wise, and then Wendy, maybe you can ask your question after that. Yeah.
I'd just like to go to a real-world situation we had, and I know Marty and David, it's the planning committee people. We did a renovation at Country Oven. Now, if that was done after this, what would happen? I'm trying to level set my mind. They would come to the design review board and bring their plans to design review board. At that point, the design review board would review, approve, negotiate, come up with a plan, and then they would bring that to the council. Bring it to the planning commission?
Yes.
Okay, so we're sticking another level in there for the DDA things, but everything would go through the same process?
Yep.
Okay,
Yet if it was on Woodward or Greenfield or 11 Mile.
right.
It doesn't
In the
affect-
DDA district, we'd have this, and for all of those changes, such as what went on at the Country Oven, where they changed the facade and those sorts of things. Okay,
Exactly.
just want to make sure I'm understanding everything.
Yeah.
Vivian,
Yeah.
is the vision of the design review board Are they a recommendation board or an approval board? Or is that up to us to decide?
Well, I see them as a recommendation board, but Norrie, can you speak to that? I mean, other design review
Yeah.
boards?
Absolutely. Both models are used very often. And in some communities, the design review board approves the design. It does not replace any of the considerations that the planning board would consider, but that approval is required. In other cases, it is advisory. Its recommendation is given to the planning commission, and the planning commission takes that into consideration when it's looking at all the other aspects of the project. They both have merit, and I don't personally lobby for one over the other. I think some of the considerations are, what is the volume of projects that you're going to be reviewing? To what extent does design influence the way in which the planning commission looks at a project for other reasons? That it's considering a conditional use, for example, is the way in which it's designed to minimize impacts on the neighborhood. Is that a key consideration to them? That might suggest you want to be able to be the one approving the design, that is the planning commission. So that's your choice, and those are the kinds of things that you would think about as you're setting up the system.
We've been able to, even though, these, they're not formal design guidelines that have been adopted by, or anything like that, but even with some of the new business owners that we have, or business owners who are looking to do just facade updates, or, just to get the DDA's facade grant money, where of course they have to, submit an application and the design committee reviews it. I've sent these design guidelines out to several people to say, hey, look at these for ideas, because this is the type of thing that we want you to consider, whether it's, an awning replacement or painting or whatever. And, just in the 6 weeks or so that I've used them, just kind of on that level with communications with new property or business owners, it's really been helpful for these guys to see visuals, because it's there, and they are very visual. So I think, they already are starting to show how useful they can be. You guys have other questions? Dennis?
I see a lot of merit to a design review board, a whole lot of merit, but it's also an extra layer of bureaucracy. And one of the things with redevelopment-ready communities is wanting to move things through quickly. Are those going to be compatible or incompatible goals? How can we make sure that the extra checks that we're adding don't discourage development and redevelopment?
So, I wish Tim was here, but the thing about the design review board is that it can also, as per the redevelopment ready communities, could possibly take on some of those maybe some of the processes that now are required to go to planning that become, an internal process that, where with redevelopment ready communities, it talks about, like Tim's role of being able to expedite some projects based on, reaching certain criteria. So perhaps this kind of falls into that role. Once again, not to ever take away from planning's role, but maybe to be able to use to expedite in some circumstances rather than just be seen as adding a layer
So,
to it.
so we might have in some situations where they are an approval
Possibly.
board, you know, in some limited things where it's just simple design changes, facade changes, and if it's something more complex, then it's a recommendation to planning commission.
Yeah.
And maybe that even gets them the idea of what the planning commission may or may not be on board with once it gets to them.
Yeah, and that's where, I mean, you know, we looked at several different options for how to bring these in. And I do like the idea of the design review board for a lot of reasons. But I do think that's a process that we have to look at and say, how does this, what fits best for who we are and how this process is best going to work? And how does it fit into the redevelopment ready communities process that we're going through? I actually think that it would be a benefit. But to your point, you know, we have to kind of sort out, you know, what are the parameters of that board and what are its roles and responsibilities. I wouldn't want to say what they are right now because I think, you know, every community is unique, and I want to make this process work for us. I want it to work for the city and for our business owners and for the DDA district. So, you know, while we all think that this is the way to move forward, you know, how the actual workings of that design review board end up, I mean, we need to figure out how that works best for us, so.
Oh, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've got 2 or 3 ideas going together, which are all really good. One is that communities often set a threshold for small-scale projects that can be approved by staff, or could be just approved by, you know, administratively, it's called. Those are particular projects that are facade renovations, things like that, that are not normally going to come before the planning commission. And yet, you can have an expedited approval process. Having well illustrated guidelines enhances predictability for larger, more complex projects that otherwise the planning commission might struggle with and might go through several iterations of having people coming back with revised designs because it isn't really clear what it is the city wants. So the argument is for being redevelopment ready is that a developer or a property owner can look at these guidelines and say, if I plan something that fits with this, I can make an investment-based projection and have an expectation that I can come out with an approved project. In fact, I can walk in showing how I am meeting the design guidelines and get that expedited approval. It does require that design review meeting, but it's 1 meeting or 2 versus 6 or however many a really challenging project might have. And in that case, it's up to the developer. If they come in willing to play with the game that Berkeley has set up, then they'll get through quickly.
Yeah.
I was kind of going to say similar, because one of the things the planning commission has, and it's totally underutilized, is a working session.
Yeah.
So this design review board,
I can't hear that.
One of the things the planning commission has that we don't utilize much is 2 weeks before our regular meeting, we could do a work session, and not many people want to plan one of those. They come to us with their plans, and then we send them back to make revisions, whereas if they come to a work session, maybe they'd come before us once. So this could potentially help with that.
Exactly.
Or the design committee becomes a work session. Just replaces that step.
Design review board?
Yeah, it replaces that step.
Yeah.
It replaces it,
Potentially,
but works on it.
potential.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's lots
Yeah,
of options. We just have to figure out what's best for us.
Yeah, you can build in a concept review stage that's an option for a property owner that helps get an early read, and that your study session is the perfect place to do that.
What are some of the communities that have, near us that have a design review board now?
Birmingham has one, Ann Arbor has one. I'm trying to remember. I don't know if Royal Oak has one. There were several. I can do some quick research and shoot them off to you. I do know that Birmingham has it, Ann Arbor has it, and there's a few other communities.
What about Clausen?
I don't remember if Clausen has one or not. Anybody else?
Well, I just have two things. I mean, if nothing else, just a statement of appreciation and then a question about timing and next steps. So, I don't want to kind of shift into that mindset, but maybe I'll start. Anyway, first of gratitude, appreciation. I mean, this is a tremendous amount of work that represents a lot of energy and thought and contributions from folks around this table and folks well into the community, and we're very appreciative for the leadership that DDA has brought to make this happen, and the participation and engagement from all of our organizations and teams to really have this reflect our community. Right? I think that's remarkable. I've had a chance to review the early drafts as well, and it is a comprehensive read, and the visualizations really help. I mean, it really does make it clear, and each thing, the taxonomy is very easy to reference, so it's well thought through, and it represents a lot of great work, so I'm very thankful for that. And in terms of next steps, is there a suggested sequence? I know there were some items on the slides earlier about potential things to go from here. I just wasn't sure if there was a specific action plan that was being proposed, or just some general thoughts that we need to kind of coordinate through the city manager in order to take definitive action. So I was wondering if there's a bit more that we could offer around, this is great, we're excited, we want to learn more. I know you mentioned there's more of a window to provide additional input and questions and things, so that certainly feels like the next-ish kind of step. But then after that, in terms of how to take action, any additional guidance you could offer on that?
Nora, did you hear that? Actual next steps.
Yeah, I think, what we wanted to do was, get direction, the temperature, at least, if you will, from the Planning Commission and Council tonight. And so I think based on that, I mean, it's not in our scope to help develop that actual ordinance and things like that, but I can certainly work with Vivian to work out a recommended set of steps that you could use in terms of having, some work session to discuss implementation and to begin to, we can at least point you to some sample ordinances, and I know Vivian can get those as well, where you could look at the organizational structure and then set up a process for how you might draft that. So we can work with her on that.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, that could be a way to activate that work session, the Planning Commission that was mentioned earlier, to bring that material there, to get that collective input and additional public dialogue on the approach.
I suppose once a draft is developed, it would just go through the same process as any ordinance adoption or amendment would do.
It feels like it. Yeah, I just wasn't sure if there was anything in addition or beyond. I know, when do we pull the trigger on that in terms of, actually saying that we take the draft off of it, or, it's still a draft till it's approved, but we're ready to go kind of material.
Well, my goal would be to try and get some language to either a work session or to the Planning Commission in July.
Nice.
I don't want these, we've put a lot of time and effort into these, and if everybody's feeling pretty positive about moving them forward, then I think we need to get them moved forward. We know we have developers who are starting to look. We obviously have developers who are already in the process. I think the sooner we can get these in place, it really will facilitate the process for planning. And like I said, we are starting now. I think in the next 6 to 12 months, we're going to start to see a lot of interest in the DDA district. And I just want to make sure that we're prepared and that we have those guidelines in place so that development that happens the way it should be. It should for this cool community and this cool
Yeah.
DDA district.
That's right, because we're talking about decisions that are 20, 30 years in ramifications, right? So if we can
Yeah.
kind of get into that. And to the point that Ms. Kempner raised about addressing the potential conflicts that are there today, perhaps with a little bit of homework on behalf of our community development director, we could kind of seed that as part of that conversation too. At least to say thematically, here's the areas that aren't affected by this, and they're still a mess, and we know we need to deal with them, but it's a different scope. And then here's the slice that's affected by this, and here's some remedies we could apply to address them thoughtfully, that kind of business.
Yeah.
So we have that comprehensive discussion. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Vivian,
Yeah, David.
this discussion, you're talking about moving it forward. Has the DDA approved this at this level? That's my first question.
The DDA?
Yeah, has the DDA, is this what the DDA wants?
Yes.
Okay, and the DDA has approved this or whatever
Well,
at this
so-
level?
Yeah, so the board can officially approve it, but, I mean, the board has been on
Okay.
board.
All right.
We meet on Wednesday.
Yes.
That would be the first step I would see, is the
Yeah.
board's got to say, here's what we want to do, and now everybody else jump in and let's.
Yeah.
And the board meets on Wednesdays.
Yep.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right, that's my question. That's all I have to say. I'm done.
Yeah.
Risk, I don't want to extend the meeting a half hour, but I've been wondering, you know, we've heard the term Berkeley-centric or, you know, a set of guidelines which reflects the character of Berkeley. And I'm just kind of wondering what kind of thinking went into making sure the guidelines were indeed reflective of Berkeley. And I'm kind of wondering if there have been other kind of design, popular design concepts which were rejected because they were not considered in keeping with the character of the community. I've just been wondering about that. How did you decide what was the character of Berkeley for purposes of developing these guidelines?
Yeah, are there other best practices that for whatever reason we've decided to set aside?
Well, I think, and Nora can jump in too, is that, you know, the very first thing we did was that public input session in September, and we really had a spectacular turnout. And that's where we really tried to hone. I mean, we had probably 45 or 50 people at the meeting, plus we had probably close to another 50 or 60 who filled out the survey online. And, you know, Nori and his team took all of that input and then basically started to draft those initial guidelines based on that input. So we never had any preconceived ideas of this is what it's going to be. It came, I mean, those people around those tables, you know, who sorted out the character districts and the sub-districts, and they're the ones who said, you know, this is who Berkeley is, this isn't who Berkeley is. And, you know, we probably had hundreds of images that in other downtowns would have been perfectly appropriate, but the people who participate in the input session said, no, that's not us, and this is us. So a lot of it, you know, came directly from that initial public input session. Nora, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, to be a little bit more specific, building height. We had images in there of some 4- and 5-story buildings that even though they were buried in massing and were articulated and stepped back, etc., people said, no, not in this location, that's not going to be appropriate. So we kept the scale not only at the street edge low, but even overall recommendations and the guidelines there. That's one specific example. We also had some examples of things that had maybe materials that people really didn't think were appropriate. A lot of synthetic stucco, for example, on large surfaces. Those images did not do well. I'm trying to think of what some of the other examples are, but in any case, trying to give you, as you look at the photographs, here's a photograph in the upper left-hand corner where people are selecting images and they were writing comments on them. We analyzed those, and out of that, we got that sense of what those participants felt were appropriate. The other side, in terms of custom tailoring, was looking at the specific sites, how big are they, what kind of development are they likely to have, so that, I mean, there were not generic illustrations of large-scale mixed-use projects that Birmingham might do. Because that's not going to occur here for a variety of reasons. And then that's why also we spent a lot of time on this finer grain aspect of what do you do with an underutilized front setback area, or what do you do with that little side yard area that's kind of sitting there gravel right now, or thinking about the owner of a small building that just wants to add a second floor. So while we're looking at some of the big idea kinds of things, they were still within the scale and the scope that we heard in the workshops people were comfortable with, that were reflected Berkeley. The other side is this finer grain, incremental fix-up of the point being trying to show that there were things that current shop owners could do and didn't always rely on the developer coming in and redoing things. And that's a part of the tailoring, I think, to the district that we worked on.
Thank you.
Vivian, just to follow up on that, I'm wondering, early on in the overview, there was a little bit of a legend of like a green check mark and a red. So within the document itself, are some of those ideas that were rejected as not being something that we were looking for, are those
Yeah.
included in the document as
Yeah.
well?
Yeah, and they'll
There's
show
a
those
couple
images.
designs.
They show the images that, were rejected and were, you get that X, that red X, it's
Very
not
helpful.
gonna work here. Yeah.
Right.
Point of clarification.
Anybody else? So we have just a couple minutes, so if you could keep it short.
I would.
This is Wendy again, Nori.
One thing, hi, one thing I was concerned with that I heard you say a little earlier was form-based code. This city looked into that and it kind of came out as, whoa, what's this? And it got taken off. I don't know if this process is part of anything like that. Okay.
No, this has nothing to do with code or land use.
Okay, and the other thing is I see you mentioning Birmingham and Ann Arbor, and we are so much smaller than those. To come up with yet another committee to do that, that work. And right now, the planning commission, there's a few buildings that things are going on, that transmission shop and Tootie and Tallulah's, that haven't come before you and are being done from, the capacity of city manager, and that quite is concerning to me, that, you've spent so much time in the La Salette, you say you have this work session, and yet,
So Wendy, that's a question for the planning
Okay,
commission
okay.
at a planning commission meeting.
got it.
Okay, and probably not something we can answer here today.
Right.
Okay.
But mainly is I'm hearing that form-based code that's very scary, and like I said, I don't know what this costs, but we spend an awful lot of money on studies, and I can only imagine what this costs.
Yeah, so form-based code, like Nori mentioned earlier, that's a land use, and this is just design. So we're not talking land use or form-based code here in just designing. Okay. Okay, I think we're good, Nori. I will say that these will be posted on the DDA's website, the downtownberkeley.com, and you'll see we've been trying to track the whole design guidelines process over the past year. And if you've been following that, you can go into that page. We'll now update that. These will be put up there with the ability for you to download them, should you decide you want to download 114 pages. Not to mention plus the additional pages in the appendix. But they will be there, and I will also just leave up, if somebody has a question or a comment, we'll leave that open for a couple weeks. So if you have neighbors or, other commission members who couldn't make it, or council members or whoever, or if you have, friends, please feel free to send them out there. Because once again, we certainly invite questions and comments. I too am very, very proud of what this Design Guidelines Task Force has done over the past year. They worked very hard. We are so grateful to Nore and his team for the efforts and work that they've put in. And I think we've received a truly superior product that is worthy of Berkeley and the DDA district, and I'm excited to see where we go from here.
Well, I join Steve in thanking you very much for all the work.
Oh, thank you. You're welcome. You're welcome. I think that's it, Nore, unless you probably are starving because you need to work through your dinner hour.
No, this was fine. It's been delightful. A really nice work session. I enjoyed it very much. And thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nore. We'll talk soon. I'll give you a call tomorrow.